You have 2 days off every week, Saturday and Sunday. You've had them your whole life. Your parents had them, and their parents had them as well. But I want to ask you something that almost nobody ever asks. Why those 2 days? And why not Tuesday and Wednesday? Tell me, who actually decided this, and why did we all agree to it? You see, the answer involves ancient Babylon, a religious argument that dragged on for 300 years, and factory owners working children 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then comes Henry Ford doing something that on the surface looked like generosity for a reason that had absolutely nothing to do with kindness. You see, the weekend isn't a gift, it's the result of a war, and most people living inside it have never once been told that story. For most of human history, there was no weekend, not because people were cruel, though of course sometimes they were, but because the whole idea of a scheduled rest day built into a 7 day week is actually a product of recent invention, and a complicated one at that. You see, the 7 day week itself, though ancient, comes from Babylon, roughly 2,500 years ago. Babylonian astronomers looked up at the sky and identified seven celestial bodies visible to the naked eye: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. And then they assigned one to each day of the week. That's actually why, in so many languages, the days of the weeks are named after planets. For example, we have Saturday, which is Saturn's day, and we have Sunday as known as the sun's day. Monday, of course, is obvious, is the moon day. So this isn't mythology. This is the literal origin of the structure of your week. A Babylonian astronomical calendar that was created even before the Roman Empire even existed is the reason you're going to call tomorrow Saturday. That is, of course, assuming that you're watching this on a Friday. But listen, into this 7 day structure came two religious traditions, each claiming a different day as sacred. Judaism, for example, established Saturday, the Sabbath day, as the day of rest, and it was protected in traditional observance. No work of any kind was permitted from sundown Friday all the way to sundown Saturday. So when early Christianity came along in trying to separate itself from Jewish tradition, it moved its day of worship to Sunday instead. So the first day of the week became a symbol as a day of resurrection. And for centuries across most of the Western world, Sunday was only guaranteed day of rest. So the working week was 6 days, sometimes seven, and for most of human history, that was simply what life was. Until the factories arrived and everything changed. The Industrial Revolution did not care about Sabbath. Factory owners in 19th century Britain needed their machines running, and to them, machines don't observe Sunday. Machines don't need rest. So the workers tending those machines, the owners argued, shouldn't either, right? So children as young as 5 worked in textile mills, 14, 16-hour days, 6 and sometimes even 7 days a week. The reformers who fought against this weren't fighting for leisure. They were actually fighting for survival, for the basic right of a child not to be worked to death before they turned 10. Because, you see, the Factory Act of the 1830s and 1840s started to limit hours for children, but adults were still fair game. And Sunday, the one day of rest, still wasn't legally protected for most workers. So what actually changed everything wasn't a law. It was a man named Robert Owen, a Welsh textile manufacturer who in 1817 proposed something so radical that his peers laughed at him. He proposed 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest and another 8 hours of whatever you want to do. He called it the 8 hour day, and it would take over a century of fighting and dying to actually win it. I want to pause here for a second, right? Because it's really easy to hear labor movement or factory reform and let it just slide past you as some history, something that happened to some people a long time ago. But the people who fought for your 2 days off weren't abstract figures in a textbook. They were actual people who went to work in the dark and came home in the dark. And not only that, they also had to watch their children do the same. And at real personal risk, sometimes at the cost of their lives, they decided this wasn't acceptable. So, your Saturday morning exists because of them. But here is where the story takes a strange turn, because the person who actually gave workers their Saturday off wasn't a union leader, a politician, or a reformer at all. It was Henry Ford. In 1926, Henry Ford did something no major industrial employer had ever done before. He voluntarily gave his workers Saturday off. So the 5-day, 40-hour working week was born inside a Ford factory, literally. And this made the labor movement to celebrate. The reformers celebrated. Workers too celebrated. But Henry Ford wasn't celebrating. He wasn't. He was calculating. Here's his actual reasoning, right? He thought that exhausted workers don't buy things. Workers with no free time have nothing to spend their money on. But when you give people a real day off, a day away from work, they will fill it with consumption. They will buy food, they will travel, and they would use their cars. And here's the thing, Henry Ford made cars. So the 5-day week wasn't an act of generosity. It was a market expansion strategy. Ford didn't give his workers their Saturday. He bought it from them in exchange for the weekend becoming an engine of a leisure economy he intended to profit from. And profit he did. So did every hotel, restaurant, cinema, and shopping mall that came after, right down to this very moment, including the platform that we use today. You see, the weekend might be the most successful piece of consumer infrastructure ever built. And most people living inside it have no idea who designed it or why. So the weekend spread, and by the 1930s, the 5-day week was standard across most of American industry. After World War II, it spread through Europe. By the 1960s, the 2-day weekend was effectively universal across the whole industrialized world. However, with it came something nobody really anticipated, and that was the guilt. You see, the guilt was that strange, persistent feeling that you're not doing enough with your days off, that you should be exercising or improving, socializing, that rest itself is somehow a failure of ambition. You see, this guilt didn't exist before the weekend. It couldn't have. Why? Because when rest was scarce, it was precious. But once it became scheduled, guaranteed, predictable, it became a performance instead. The weekend basically became a product. That was it. 2 days that billions of people spend trying to recover from 5 days just so they can, survive another 5 more. The 8-hour day that Robert Owen imagined, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of whatever you will, became for most people something much closer to 5 days of exhaustion and 2 days of recovering, and then you repeat. That's the weekend you inherited, not the one anyone actually fought for. So you see that the weekend you just had, or the one coming up, was designed by a Babylonian astronomer, argued over by theologians for 3 centuries, stolen from workers by factory owners, and then fought back for at real cost by people whose names you will never know. And finally, it was handed back to you by Henry Ford so that you'd have time to spend money. That is the story. And see, I'm not telling you this to make you cynical. I think knowing the actual history of something changes how you live inside it. Because let's face it, we don't have a choice. We would have to live inside it. So if you know your Saturday was fought for, you might choose to, live it a little differently than someone who just assumes it was always there. And if you know your Sunday was partly designed to sell you things, perhaps you might decide what to do with it a bit more deliberately. But at the end of the day, what I want you to say is that nothing in your life is as ordinary as it looks, and that includes your weekend. So, having said all that, if something in your world looks a little different after watching this, that's exactly the point. So I want you to do me a favor. Subscribe, because next week we'll be looking at something else you've walked past probably 1,000 times without ever really saying it.